Well, good morning.
Good morning.
This morning, Philippe and I will be talking about a question that's been coming up a lot, this question about violent flanks and nonviolent discipline. And we'll be doing an exercise, and then each of us will be making a presentation based on our own expertise on this topic, such as it is. But before we get started, I'll just let you know how we hope to run this session. The exercise we're going to do first so that we get everybody up and engaged. And then what we hope to do is do our presentations sequentially. And we're hoping to do them a little bit like lectures. So we'll each spend 20 minutes going through the content in a fairly focused manner. And we would ask people to save their questions for the end, because that way we'll be able to really economize time and have a really good discussion after our both of our presentations. So with that, we will get started with Philippe running our exercise.
Well, together.
Yeah, well, we're both doing it, but you know,
so,
he's...
Okay, let's get going. Have a seat anywhere, by the way. This is not your regular seat, and you're going to go back to it right after. Let's go. We're going to ask you to think about two questions to share and discuss, and to bring us back some of your discussion. The first question is, from what you have seen or your own experience, what are some of the reasons that people say that violence must be used? What are some of the common reasons that people invoke in support of using violence? So justifications to use methods that can kill, maim, or injure. Okay? You have 7 minutes. Let's go. Are some of the main reasons people invoke to use violence?
So sometimes they are confronted to violence themselves.
Facing violence.
They live in violent environment.
Facing violence itself.
Yeah. They feel
So
that they
say that once. I'm just going to go quickly, popcorn style. So
Okay.
I'm just going to you just grab the voice when you hear an empty moment.
Ask this person wants to say something.
Because people don't have knowledge and education about nonviolence.
Lack of knowledge about nonviolent conflict.
They want to get quick results.
Quick results.
Some use violence as a last resort.
Last resort.
That's the same.
That's the saying.
Yeah, last chance to defend the movement.
For many, it's the first chance.
For many. We're not debating. We're just main reason.
Fear.
Fear.
Power.
Power.
Protection, revenge.
Vengeance, yeah.
Vengeance.
Revenge.
Attention.
Revenge.
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 Frustration.
Manipulation.
Intervention of other parties.
Intervention of other parties.
Countries.
Foreign countries. Thank you.
I'll throw out one more. I say misinterpretation of history, both violent history and nonviolent history.
Yeah, but are these reasons that people will tell you?
Yes.
I'm misrepresenting
No,
history.
but folks, they'll argue. They'll have their own interpretation
Twist.
of history
Yeah, right.
about what nonviolent action is achieved.
That's
and
right.
what violence.
Okay, so wrong history or misinterpretation. Culture. So can you just be more specific?
Manipulated culture of violence.
Culture of violence. Thank you.
Habit? Did somebody say habit?
Cultures of violence.
Easy access.
Plural.
To weapons.
Easy access to weapons.
Honor.
Honor. Okay.
Police violence.
Police violence.
Yes, people start protesting peacefully, but the police come with violence.
So
We
again,
got that.
facing violence and then saying we got to respond with violence. Okay. Okay, one last. Ideology. Yes,
Let's
thank
take
you.
Irina's as well. Irina.
I just wanted to mention the regional context. Like I had it in my country, Ukraine was getting really violent at some point, and we felt waves coming to our country too. So people were just looking what neighbors are doing, felt like doing
So regional influences or.
Isn't it psychological?
Okay, on to, sorry, what?
One is the psychological problem.
Psychopathy?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Psychopath, yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you. So, but these are not usually the reasons people will give to say, I prefer violence because I'm a psychopath.
Some do.
Okay, question number 2, and perhaps the most important here, what actions can you take, or have you seen taken, to strengthen nonviolent discipline in movements that you've seen or know about? So have you seen specific interventions that try to help movements stay nonviolent? What were these? What did it look like? How did they work? So spend a few minutes discussing that and coming up with a few examples of things that can be done to support nonviolent discipline. So what are some of the things you found was used or perhaps useful or that you can think of might be useful in terms of helping nonviolent discipline within movements?
Preparation, preparation, preparation.
3 words to summarize. Preparation, preparation, and preparation. Thank you for that.
Spiritual training.
Spiritual.
training.
Yeah.
Spiritual training, okay. Sorry, I have a French ear, so it's harder for me to
Focus on the end result.
Focus on the end result.
Capacity building,
Leadership.
leadership,
Maintaining the boundary.
art,
A strategic plan.
a strategic plan.
Fundraising.
Fundraising helps
Allowing participation.
allowing participation.
If you pay people, they will not be violent, or what? What is with the fundraising?
Yeah.
Establishing rules.
Establishing rules.
Leaders,
Code of conduct.
leaders of the protest serving as police, as stewards to control.
Unity.
Having people that, as stewards?
Yeah, leaders of the protest they serve as stewards to control.
Yes, so stewards, marshals, peacekeepers are sort of the same thing, yeah.
Focus on a general cause. Can't be an individual. Focus on a general cause.
Focus on the end goal, the general cause. Keep your eyes on the prize, as they used to say in the civil rights movement.
Accountability.
Accountability.
Popular education.
Popular education.
Diversity.
University.
Diversity.
Diversity. Yes.
Membership.
Members should be diverse.
Yeah.
Okay.
Learning from mistakes.
Learning from mistakes.
Sharing best practices of
Best
nonviolent-
practices. Commitment.
Maintaining confidence and hope.
Confidence and
The
hope.
moment.
Okay, I'll take 2 more.
Negotiation.
Ownership.
Criminal prosecution.
Criminal prosecution, for those who, yes, okay. Okay, so we have 2 lists on the board. Common rationales for using violence and ways for movements to reinforce nonviolent discipline. Care to read what's on the common rationales that we got?
Sure. We have culture. They face violence themselves. Habit. Psychopathy. They don't have knowledge. They replicate results from elsewhere. They want a quick result. They have easy access to weapons. They see it as a last resort. Foreign invasion, fear, power, frustration, vengeance, and the myths about violence and nonviolence. And then ways for movements to reinforce nonviolent discipline. Preparation, really it should be it's times 3. Spiritual training, accountability, focus on the end result, diversity of members, learning best practices and mistakes, art, leadership, training, codes of conduct, organization, ownership, criminal prosecution, fundraising, marshals and accompaniment, and allowing participation.
We had constant motivation.
What's that?
Constant motivation.
Motivation.
Okay.
So, other than what's perhaps missing, we can't ever complete, anything strikes you as an obvious takeaway from what we learned here? What do you see on the table there that you might bring home and say?
I
think on the right side we see more like long-term thing and more commitment and more in-depth, and on the left side we see more this instant, like which goes very much with today's culture, I think. So yeah, more instant impacts and effect.
Good. That's profound. Thank you. Yeah. Anything else we see when we look at this?
Well, it's something about also both, and it's one of my burning questions. That one prerequisite, for example, for Gandhi was a willing to suffer. We will be able to face this kind of repression and violence in us. But many people, and that's a problem maybe why they don't use nonviolence, doesn't want to suffer. They are really like concerned about their body and about their comfort, and they say, yeah, I can stay in a struggle, but I don't want to suffer. I don't want to be put in jail or maybe killed. Like in Mexico, they just kill you or disappear you, not just put you in jail. So people doesn't want to do like this kind of will. So it's something I see. Yeah, we can have this kind of spiritual preparation because we don't have this will to suffer. And that's a very, how can we do it? People doesn't want to do that. How can we face repression?
Key point. Thank you for bringing that. I'll take two more on this side, and then Erica will be presenting.
I just want to say that this side looks like more scientific, more art, more misgiving, whereas components here develop, harvest, and maybe become more soft. I don't know if it's more feminine, but I think.
Interesting. So, if you were to look at these lists in terms of gender, you could see masculine characteristics on the left and more feminine characteristics. I mean, they can leave some things, but there's a lot of debate, but there's.
We don't have the knowledge.
Right, no, we're not debating that. That's just the point that was made.
We don't have the knowledge for you to make that assessment.
No, I am not. I'm repeating what was just said. Here, next.
Yeah. I'm also just thinking, is it feasible to imagine that at times you have to use some form of violence to quiet down? I'm a Swahili, and like we said, cultural. Sometimes there's a saying that says peace does not come unless you use force. So if you have people who are violent, for instance, what happened in Naval, yeah? So he had to be shot to stop the violence. So is that something to think about? Is it one way of sometimes you have to use violence to stop violence?
So you're raising a question, and I asked for things that you see on the thing. It's a very live question. It's a very relevant question, and it's one that we want to.
Yeah.
It should be a burning question. When, like, are there cases where you need to use violence? And
Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about that next.
Good. So we'll just jump right into your presentation.
Cool.
Can we just move to our seats?
Yes.
Yes, please do that. Quickly.
Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on with the next portion of this session. As I mentioned, what we'd like to do here is I'm just going to move through some material fairly quickly just to put across some of the main ideas here, and then Philippe will present, and then we'll do questions and comments. So if questions come up for you while I'm talking, just write them down for yourself and we'll revisit them at that point. Also, I want to mention that Philippe and I did not coordinate our outfits on purpose, but it happens. Okay, so what I want to mention first is that I have not really been myself a participant in a lot of the types of campaigns that you all have experienced or witnessed. And so what I'm going to talk about here is based solely on some of my insights based on my reading of the current literature and my own research on this topic. And so I welcome actually challenges or qualifications or resistance to these ideas for my own learning and for everyone's learning. But I did want to revisit just a couple things that came up yesterday about the fact that nonviolent mass campaigns of civil resistance are on the rise globally. And in fact, major violent campaigns, despite what it looks like in the news, are on the decline in terms of new onsets. So nonviolent resistance in the past about 4 or 5 decades has started to become the main form in which people try to change the situations in which they live. And by and large, the aggregate success rates, even through the end of 2015, of nonviolent campaigns are staggering and much more impressive than the success rates of violent campaigns. They have about a 2-to-1 advantage in terms of their success rates. And the reasons for this are based on the fact that nonviolent campaigns are able to inhere much greater and more diverse participation from the population. More people, women, children, people with disabilities, elderly populations, minority populations, are willing to participate in a mass campaign when it is committed to nonviolent resistance. We have very strong evidence to support that claim. And in fact, the average nonviolent campaign as a proportion of a population of a country is some 11 times larger than the average violent campaign. And the reason this participation is so important is because it allows popular movements to directly put pressure on, in some cases, convince different pillars of support that it is no longer in their interest to support the status quo. So as Hardy mentioned yesterday, there are all kinds of ways in which people participate actively through consent and obedience in the status quo system. And when very large numbers of people from very diverse backgrounds begin to engage in non-cooperation over sustained periods of time, they start to make the status quo costly for people that benefit from it. So security forces, economic elites, business elites, and the like. And because of that, those pillars of support that are supporting that status quo begin to shift in terms of their own interests and start to wonder whether it makes sense for them to defect. So that's kind of a review, and we're going to talk a lot more about dynamics of defection and other things along those lines. But I wanted to point out this slide, which demonstrates that despite the fact that we've, by and large, seen an increase in the success rates of civil resistance campaigns through 2010, since 2010, we've seen a pretty severe decline in the success rates of these campaigns. So one of the big takeaways is that we're seeing it more common, but we're also seeing it less effective relative to what it has been in the past few decades. Now, there is a bright side if you're an advocate of nonviolent resistance, which is that violent resistance is also declining in its effectiveness pretty seriously. So in fact, the relative effectiveness of nonviolent resistance has actually grown because it's now 3 times more effective than the average violent campaign. Now, there are a number of different reasons why this decline, absolute decline in effectiveness, might be taking place. One of them may be related to the fact that, as we mentioned yesterday, governments may be learning very quickly about how to adapt and react to these campaigns. A second reason might simply be one that Xavier mentioned yesterday, which is the possibility that movements learn the wrong lessons from each other quite often and simply try to replicate the model from their neighboring country into their own, predisposing them to disaster. I also have a hunch that some of this is driven by the fact that that a growing proportion of nonviolent mass campaigns seem to be willing to tolerate or even endorse violent flanks that are existing alongside them. So here is a graph that shows the proportion of nonviolent mass campaigns that have some violent flank activity alongside them. So when I talk about violent flank, I'm talking about a group of people that are attached to the movement and who engage on a routine basis in some form of violence. And that can include destruction of property by this definition, but it also can include lethal violence against the opponent. Now, the level of violence that would take place here would still distinguish these nonviolent campaigns, primarily nonviolent campaigns, from, say, a riot or a civil war or an insurgency. It's not that level of violence that they're using, but that there is a routine experience to where when there is a protest or when there's a demonstration, we start to expect that there's going to be some violence on the fringes by the movement. Now, it's really important for me to point out that almost every campaign in this data set experiences violence by the regime. Almost every one, because I'm looking at maximalist campaigns. So what this is saying is that a growing proportion of these campaigns are not able to react to regime repression with nonviolent discipline. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the definition of violence that I'm using. It's a definitely contested definition, but it's the one I'm using primarily for measurement reasons. It's an observable form of violence, it's a direct form of violence, and it is a form of violence that's universally accepted as violence. So there are other forms of violence, structural violence, emotional violence, psychological violence. We all know that. But what I'm just going to talk about here is direct violence, physical violence that harms or threatens to harm another person physically. Whereas nonviolent action is any action by unarmed people that uses or applies some kind of direct action against them, but without using or threatening to use physical harm. In the NAVCO data set, which covers countries from 1900 to 2006, about 30% of the campaigns of nonviolent action had in attendance with them some dimension of a violent flank. Most of them were what we call extra movement violent flanks, which means they grew up outside of the movement. So the movement wasn't themselves supporting them, but they claimed to be part of this broader kind of contentious moment. And then we have intra-movement campaigns, which are the ones that I'm the most interested in, the ones where the movements themselves develop or tolerate such a flank. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we would expect these violent flanks to help the nonviolent campaign. And I would say that these reasons are often repeated in a lot of conventional discourse about civil resistance. So I want to take them seriously, and then I want to subject them each to some empirical tests to find out whether they're actually holding up across a large population of cases. So the first thing that many scholars have said is that by endorsing or using just a little bit of violence aside a large popular campaign, it will raise the profile of that campaign by making it look serious and committed. It will also raise the profile of its members by separating them from the broader population as a vanguard of true radicals. Another thing that's often said is that violence is necessary because people face violence themselves. And by using violent flanks, it provides the movement to defend itself against the worst forms of violence. Another reason is that's often used to justify this is that by adopting a violent flank, a movement can credibly threaten to escalate to a broader and more intense level of conflict that causes the opponent to try to accommodate it in its early stages. Another thing that can happen is that a violent flank can make the nonviolent movement look really good and make it look like a moderate partner that the government should negotiate with, as opposed to these crazy radicals over here that we're really scared of. Another thing that some labor theorists and activists have argued is that by engaging in the most militant types of action, it will solidify people's commitment lifelong to the cause and make them more militant later in life, allowing them to push further and further along in creating a culture of radical commitment. And then finally, some people have argued that violence can create a symbology or kind of an iconography, a myth about the national unity of a population, and that it has certain really important cultural reference that allow people to identify strongly with the movement. Now, we might also expect there to be some important negative effects of violent flanks. The first of which is the experience of putting the movement on a plane in which the regime has a decided advantage, which is to say the use of force. So as soon as a movement starts to adopt or endorse or embrace a violent flank, they've placed themselves into a category of dissent that the regime is quite familiar with dealing with. The second thing is that it can discredit all regime opponents. For example, even if the 95% of the movement is nonviolent, if even just a small percentage of the movement starts to adopt violence, usually the regime will use that to call them all terrorists or to completely denounce the entire group. It then, therefore, provides further justification for widespread repression, not just against the movement, but against associates with the movement. In many countries, association with people accused of terrorism is itself a crime. And so then these countries have a much greater justification, even legally in their own countries, for engaging in the worst kinds of repression. Because of that, it creates an entirely different set of risks for people that would volunteer to participate in these movements. And so what we might see is that movement participation declines, both in terms of its size, but also in terms of the diversity of the participants. So one thing that is commonly seen is that once street fighting starts in a nonviolent movement, women leave. And so the remaining people that are participating are typically young, able-bodied males who are willing to engage physically in street fighting. And that reduces a huge amount of people in the society who could potentially come and join the campaign and activate all those different points of leverage with the pillars of support that I mentioned before. Another thing that can happen is that violent flanks can alienate potential third-party supporters. Violence is by definition a tactic of polarization. Polarization means dividing the society into very discrete camps that support or oppose an idea. It kind of eliminates people in the middle from having their own independent views. And so because of that, we would expect fewer defections by security forces and police when a campaign starts to use violence. And then it should decrease the likelihood of backfire. Backfire is the dynamic where repression is counterproductive, that it produces the opposite effect of what was intended. So we actually have data that we can use to subject all of these arguments, pro and con, to some empirical tests. So one of these is an article that Kurt Schock and I published in December of 2015 in a special issue of Mobilization that Sharon edited, where what we find is that actually if you use the NavCode data, which is the data set a lot of people have been citing here, we did code some of the nonviolent campaigns, as I mentioned, as having a violent flank. And if you look at all of the campaigns that faced lethal repression from their regimes, what we can see is that the campaigns that maintained nonviolent discipline had the highest rates of success. The campaigns that were nonviolent with a violent flank had lower rates of success, and that violent campaigns, that is outright armed insurgencies, had the lowest rate of success. Now this is at the aggregate campaign level. It's only looking at maximalist campaigns, trying to overthrow the incumbent government or trying to create territorial independence. So what about those other movements that are just trying to get labor rights or trying to get education reform or things like that? Well, fortunately, there's an economist at Middlebury University who has a working paper where he uses 23,000 incidents of protest in France to try to understand the effects of violent protests that involve actually property damage in his classification versus disruptive yet nonviolent techniques is how he describes them. And what we can see here is that using a much larger set of cases, that violence across the board, regardless of model specification, reduces the chances that the opponent concedes to the protest. So what about the participation rates? Kurt Schock and I in our article focused on how a contemporaneous violent campaign, that is a violent flank, affected the participation size of a primarily nonviolent campaign. And we found that it reduces participation in nonviolent campaigns. Now, there are a couple limitations to this analysis, the worst of which is the thing circled in red there, the very small sample size because of missing data. And so there's another scholar named Elizabeth Tompkins who published a paper after hours where she actually tried to look at the change over time in different nonviolent campaigns on participation and on repression and repressive behavior by the regime. And so she has more than 200 observations, which gives us a lot more confidence in the stability of these findings. And she finds that having a violent flank decreases mobilization to a significant extent. And she also finds that it tends to increase indiscriminate repression. That is, repression not only against movement participants, but against their families and against their friends and against their communities. In other words, violent flanks tend not to protect people. They tend to make more people, including people that aren't even directly involved in the movement, at greater risk of repression. That's going to explain or help us to explain why then people would be angry at the movement and not participate in it after it forms a violent flank. Now, I'm running out of time a little bit, but I also want to talk about how third parties see violent flanks. So these are fence sitters or would-be defectors or sympathizers who could join the campaign. And Omar Wassow, who's a professor at Princeton University, has a very powerful paper where he looks at 60,000 different protest events, what he calls protest events, during the US civil rights movement. And there was a decided period in the civil rights movement where, as we saw in the film, the primary method of contention was nonviolent methods of action. And what he does is he lines that up with public opinion polling that occurred on a week-to-week basis of Americans regarding what they were most concerned about. And what you can see in this chart is that the more black protests there were that were nonviolent, the higher the rates of Americans that responded that the most important issue facing this country is civil rights. Now look what happens once the protests start to become more violent in the late 60s. Here, what we can see is a swing in public attitudes from the most important issue is civil rights to the most important issue is law and order, restoring stability, right? So how does that affect long-term electoral prospects for the movement to actually build power from below and from more elite levels? Well, what Wassow did was he used those public opinion polls and correlated them with people's choice for the president of the United States. And it turns out that the vast majority of people who argued that law and order was more important were also the people that were more likely to vote for Richard Nixon or Alabama Governor George Wallace, who was pro-segregation. He was the Donald Trump of the time. So basically what we see is that there was a huge swing in support of pro-segregationist, anti-kind of progressive politicians. And here's the really devastating thing. Wassow actually does a replication where he finds that if the protests that were violent had been nonviolent, that Hubert Humphrey would have won the presidential election if public opinion polls would have followed the trajectory that he expects. So there are really serious long-term political effects to these short-term tactical decisions. There are other long-term political effects that are more relevant to the maximalist campaigns that I have mentioned, including the very scary possibility of civil war recurrence going up in a really major way, like a 10 times larger probability than for just purely nonviolent campaigns when movements adopt a violent flank. So here's the empirical evidence. It's overwhelming in favor of negative violent flank effects. Even though we can understand why people think that they would help, they actually look damaging to not just nonviolent campaigns, but those that would sympathize with them, those that are related to them, and they hurt them on a strategic level as well, which is to say that they reduce participation rates, they reduce participation diversity, they repel potential allies, they remove the possibility in many ways for really serious defections occurring in those pillars of support. and as a consequence, they decrease the chances that these movements succeed. They also tend to increase the chances of bad things happening longer term. So I guess the overall thesis here is that people who make the argument that violence will be helpful are, and based on this evidence, somewhat naive about the degree to which they can control the dynamics of violence once they're unleashed. So I'm going to leave it at that and welcome Philippe for his segment.
I went on to organize with others, of course, a major shutdown of the main government building in Quebec City with 100 people shutting down the whole G complex. If you go to Quebec City, it's the tallest building in the city. And we were demanding an end to the neoliberal policies being adopted by the Parti Québécois at the time. 1996 was Operation Salami, which really was the birthday of the alternative globalization movement in Quebec. Salami became a household word in Quebec. AMI standing for Accord Multilatéral sur l'Investissement, MAI in English, and we called it the Dirty Friend. And we shut down the Conférence de Montréal, which is a major economics conference on globalized economies. 1999, we were back, but this time with a teach-in in the streets about the dynamics of globalization and what was happening in Bolivia at the time, and like all kinds of workshops held in the streets. So doing a blockade but in a very different way. And then 1999 was Seattle. I went to Seattle. There was the World Trade Organization trying to push now the same agenda on a global scale. And basically, you know, I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but it's called free trade, but it's really about investors' rights over setting up tribunals, basically by 3 judges that reign over our own legislations, our own constitution at the time. So Seattle was, I found very, when I got there, I went straight to the training center, the hub for the actions. And there were trainings, there were guidelines, but right from when you got there, you saw the papers, the flyers that were promoting the Black Bloc. We'll get into that. So Seattle is now remembered for scenes like this, but Seattle was also, for most of the day, November 30th, 1999, a tremendous success of a blockade. The meeting couldn't happen, it was canceled. The whole world got to know about what was potentially bad about these agreements. So it became known as the riot in Seattle. And what I witnessed from my own eyes that day was, for instance, in the morning getting to the site and seeing a black-clad young man with a mask. He looked very, very hyper. I saw a young woman go up to the guy he was throwing down the newspaper boxes and the post office boxes. And she just went up to him and said, you know, we agreed, we have guidelines here that this is nonviolent. And he just punched her in the face. That was the end of it. Later in the day, as for those of you who remember, there were shutdowns of all the streets and people actually locking arms, some of them using devices such as cement blocks, blockading 13 points around the convention center. And that's when we started seeing people coming and throwing things above the blockaders to the police, and then the police firing back on the protesters. If you get the scene, there's the hotel, there's a blockade of nonviolent activists that are trained, that are very disciplined, and then you have, of course, many people who are onlookers, and then you start having black-clad people coming to throw things at the police, creating a scene that was intense repression. That's when I personally hit a wall in my organizing in Quebec about globalization. This is the Quebec City Summit in May of 2001. Yesterday I showed the search and seizure operation. You know, when we went to demand the text. That was 3 weeks before that. We knew this was coming. We knew that I guess you could say we took a bigger bite than what we could chew. My hope going into Quebec City was that the labor unions and that could help have marshalling to a day big walk. But they ended up walking kilometers away from the scene. I understand why. But this is what happened on the day of and the start of it. And needless to say, a movement that you've worked for 5 years, but at this point, it felt to me like we were losing a lot of ground on that day. I'm not going to tell you about the many ways in which I was personally attacked, featured in newspapers from the anarchist segments or whatever, but there was an intense campaign to denigrate not only the strategic nonviolent action, but also those who are proponents of it. So what happened? What came to the fore, and I'm very aware that I'm discussing a North American context. I'm saying this in the hope that it might be relevant elsewhere, because there's some variations of it perhaps in your own home countries. One thing is for certain, those of us who promote, organize nonviolent civil resistance are sort of caught between a repressive apparatus and some of our friends who believe in violence. It's a tough place to be sometimes. And what has emerged, and I think that's part of my explanation, is a framework that is called respect for a diversity of tactics. It sounds great, and I'm going to explain it to you. What does it mean? So-called nonviolence is not the only strategic, just, or legitimate means by which to achieve fundamental change for social justice. Respect for a diversity of tactics also asserts open solidarity with people engaged in resistance and struggle for social justice. So you have two things there. It's not the only one, and we need to stand in solidarity. We need unity, a unified approach. Like this is like, let's get beyond violent and nonviolent. We're all together now. We have an umbrella to work under. Petty tactical differences should not divide us. We need a united front. Nonviolent and not nonviolent, all tactics should work together. No tactic should be ruled out as a policy. We need all the tools we can get. And we have the right to choose any tactic. Individuals have a right to violent or nonviolent tactics. It's their choice. No code of behavior should be enforced, and there should at least be one zone that is free of all restrictions and nonviolent action guidelines. Freedom. And there should be no public criticism of other tactics before, during, or after the events. Because we're all in this together, and let's not divide us, at least not publicly. So let's not make this out, get out of the activist circles. Well, the thing about now criticism of other tactics, of course, doesn't apply to nonviolent action. There's all kinds of propaganda on the ground among students, especially younger folks, really hammering twisted versions of history, like the civil rights movement won because of the Black Panther Party, for instance. That this was the main force, and Martin Luther King was a liberal, so he was able to negotiate things, the kind of things that you talked about. And so I'd say in North America right now, in every major city, there's usually 40 to 50 hardcore people who are into this stuff. They have their websites, they have their literature, and it's basically promoting rioting alongside any kind of mass movement. So what this really means is we should not criticize the black bloc tactics. What are black bloc tactics? Well, you've seen the pictures. This is Toronto, the G20, in 2012, was it? No, that's 2010. So breaking windows, fighting the police, throwing projectiles, firebombing, sticks and steel rods, smashing cars and media vehicles, unintended injuries to others, and intimidating and beating other protesters and other organizers. The whole concept is called the green zone, the yellow zone, and the red zone. The red zone is where anything can happen. The yellow zone would be the civil disobedience. You want to have your civil disobedience? You can have it too, right over there. We'll riot over here, and you can do your sit-in over there. And you can have your family demonstration over there. Perfect. Of course, it doesn't work that way. So in the name of diversity, you end up with clear cutting. Everything ends up being this riotous zone with high repression. And you've all seen the scenario, or at least on TV. It's very predictable. In my opinion, tactical diversity goes out the window. Trying to do civil disobedience and nonviolent action in this context is suicidal, because the beast has been unleashed. The justification for repression is out there. So I've seen a lot of brothers and sisters, people coming to these things, getting beat up because the whole... So that explains part of the reason why participation is down. I care very much about this because I think it leads to defeat and very much suffering for nothing. We all know the figure, the magic number of 3.5% leading to something close to 100% success rate. We know from the data that violent flanks reduce participation, and we now know also that it reduces success. Brian Martin came up with, well, that's when I found out about it. He didn't create it, but the correspondent inference theory. A very fancy name to say, because the saying goes in the movements that people are just brainwashed by the media. And they're kind of stupid because they can't differentiate between the system's violence and, you know, the little violence that happens when windows are broken and that. And that therefore, you know, we just need to educate people that this violence doesn't matter. Well, there's actually proof that people actually think you are what you show. That if you tend to lead, your actions tend to lead to destruction, this movement is about destruction. I tend to believe it's not that stupid. That it's a gut feeling that what we're about is what we're showing in the public arena. I also think that these violent flanks rob participants from informed consent. People get into situations they're not prepared for, and they have no way of knowing in advance unless they become seasoned. So we saw yesterday the three keys to strategic success: planning, unity, discipline. I want to talk about the third, and what are the three keys to nonviolent tactical success. If you leave with only one thing today, it could be that. In my 30 plus years of organizing, I have never organized an action that turned violent based on these three ingredients: guidelines, preparation, training, and on-site peacekeeping. Remove one of these three and the whole platform wobbles. Guidelines. It means having clear behavioral recommendations that are public, that are part of your literature. And when you invite people, it's based on these guidelines. They're repeated, they're enforced. And they're usually very simple, no physical violence, no verbal abuse, because we know the continuum starts usually with the insults. And the weapons and the drugs. And although there's a whole debate about material damage, usually for mass actions you don't want any form of material damage. And those guidelines guarantee basically our capacity to have informed consent and avoid this open season on activists, because you know what the person next to you is going to be doing. 2, preparation. Little Red Riding Hood walking into a war zone calls for preparation. Our opponents are well trained. We need to create groups that know each other, that can interact together, that have a measure of accountability. And this needs to be mandatory for any level of risk to your to getting arrested in particular, but any high-risk situation should have mandatory training. Please come, and if you want, in my experience, if you don't make it mandatory, you're skirting the responsibility. The idea is to be prepared for consequences and to build that resilience. And we've seen this through the work that Jim and others have done, is how much that preparation is the way to prevent our own people from losing it, and to reach a stage where our concept of fighting back, we're not giving up on the concept of fighting back. We're fighting back differently through strategic actions. I showed you yesterday a bit of that clip, the search and seizure tactic, and I told you it was repeated this year in New Zealand, just to show you a bit how training might look. Well, most of you, or some of you might know, but I just thought. So these are basically workshops, and we've seen with Jim great training. Number 3, peacekeeping on site. If you look at this picture, this is the search and seizure, and I'm going to show it to you because I think it's so great. You can see that row of people. Oh, and if I go back, the white berets there. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mary or Jim, but these were people trained as peacekeepers, the white berets. I was told that these were people who were sort of there to make sure nonviolent discipline was adhered to in some of the things. Is that right?
That's what I've been told too.
Yeah, okay.
They were a group from New York, as I remember.
Okay. For this action, you can see Peacekeeper on the left, and they basically separate the action from the street. Make sure that the people who are doing the nonviolent direct action are all trained and know what to do. And let me show you this action, because I think they executed it great. And that's the power of nonviolent action and of a design that can be replicated. If you imagine the black bloc around that, it becomes all impossible. So peacekeeping as a strategically nonviolent component must remain strictly nonviolent itself. So it calls itself for training. It needs to be well organized, and it avoids, in some cases, even having to go to the police. I want to give this example. José Bové is a very well-known campesino power organizer. I see smiles in the room. He confided in me that they face the same problem there in France. Of course, France has a love affair with violence in demonstrations. And so there are creative ways to create those peacekeeping forces. One of them was in Millau in France. They had the people facing charges for dismantling a McDonald's restaurant. They did that. It's a long story, but basically to resist the imposition of beef with hormones from the U.S. being imposed on them, and the free trade rules being applied to the cheese that they're making, the Roquefort, the blue cheese. Lovely. And what they did there in Milo is get the people who were facing trial, those most at risk, doing the lines. And so it was clear to people if rioting tactics were going to be used, that these were going to be the people who are already sacrificing most, who would suffer the consequences. So I thought it was a clever way to play on the peacekeeping force. And of course, we're not, again, Little Red Riding Hood. We need to prepare for agents provocateurs. But again, undercover infiltrators, agents doubles, all of them, you know, they can be embedded for years. They will talk the language, they will dress the same, they will live with us. And so these are two cases. You can look them up, Google them. Some of them, there's whole movies about their career. And so we'd be very naive to think that nonviolent movements are not being undermined very actively. And we have to prepare for this. So remember the 3 keys: guidelines, training, peacekeeping. And I'd like to see us more involved. This is one of the websites. Check it out if you want, submedia.tv. This is the kind of stuff that young people really get into because it's creative. It's got punk music. They call it riot porn. And it really is peddling the ideology, the falsehoods, the historical falsehoods. And my heart breaks because I don't see us getting out there with resources that I can just hand. Look, this is from ICNC. This is a one-pager. Like, we're not nimble in the field with young people especially. I love the academic papers. I read them all. But I want stuff that we can spread on the street and actually use with organizers and to take down that material. So how do we deal with this? I'd say to deal with the diversity of tactics, we need, I suggest 5 things. Monitoring first, like know what's out there, what are their arguments, their rationale. 2, in my experience, you need to put the nonviolent principle, the civil resistance principle, in the DNA of an organization as early as you can. Because later it becomes hard when these people come in and will actually try to shift your platform. So being very intentional from the get-go, we are going to be publicly identified and branded as nonviolent. Third, of course, there's no shortcut to organizing powerful campaigns that work. Success is going to be our greatest propaganda tool, or educational tool, I should say. 4, preparation, training. I was very moved and inspired by the fact that Jim Lawson would have training, educational, opening every SCLC student, Southern Christian Leadership Conference meetings with Martin Luther King sitting in the front row. Like, you always have to do it. You can't assume people understand the dynamics and what we're sharing here this week. We need to always train and prepare and educate people. Finally, I'd suggest we would need sometimes to have targeted interventions to promote and defend strategic civil resistance and counter diversity of tactics, misrepresentations. So that might be sending people out to some conferences with alternative material, debating with our anarchist friends or others who are promoting things. So this is my 10 cents on this, and hopefully we have time for questions.